Okay, good morning to all the listeners. Thank you so much for taking time to listen to our podcast yet again. Today, I am excited to bring you an esteemed guest. I am in conversation with Peter. Peter is a digital transformation guru. He has written a book on digital transformation that I sat and just read through the night. It's an amazing book. I think everybody should put their hands on that if you want to understand and just learn what digital transformation is all about and gain insights around the subject. So we are going to get into our conversation straight on. I'm going to ask Peter to tell us more about himself. Peter, welcome to the podcast. Please, can you just tell our listeners who you are and what you do, and just the journey that you've walked in your career?
Morning, Sarah, and morning to your listeners. It's great to be here, and thank you very much for having me. Yes, I've spent my career 25 years, mainly in banking, about half of that in consulting, and then the rest of that in various leadership positions at large banks in South Africa, where I've mainly been driving, change in those organizations. And in the last decade or so, I think we've all been grappling with this idea of digital transformation as a sort of umbrella term for all the change that typically large organizations are trying to achieve. And yes, through that process and through my career, I did my PhD on agile software engineering. I've developed a lot of content and courses, and I've seen the huge need for education and inspiration to go hand in hand with whatever change that you're trying to achieve. And that's typically been a strong point for me in my leadership style over the years. And so thank you. The book that I wrote and that I developed a course about has been one of my bestsellers, and really just brings together all of the lessons that I've learned and that I've had experience of in driving digital transformation. But yes, Sarah, it's a wide and important topic for us all to grapple with. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Fantastic. Peter, do you just want to tell us where you currently work and just a little bit of the journey? I went to LinkedIn just to look you up, and you've had quite a colorful career in digital transformation. Please just tell our listeners just about your journey.
Thank you, Sarah. Absolutely. So been at FNB really for the last 12, 13 years, I guess. And the last 4 years of that, helping to plan and manage the portfolio of programs that make up our digital transformation. And I suppose if you look at any organization's interpretation of digital transformation, it's going to be slightly different. And for us, it's about becoming more platform-based in how we enable the business models and the ecosystems that we support and that we help, manage and encourage through our customers and our networks and our, third parties and everybody that interacts through the use of our products and services across our wide range of businesses and the continuum of customers that we serve. So planning and organizing all the different programs and projects that become very interdependent in that overall journey is a big job. And, we have a model of owner-managed execution in our businesses. So while we have a very small team centrally that guide the overall journey, the work is still done as per our culture in our business units, where they are the CEOs, the pilots of the planes, if you like, and we're just the air traffic control, if you want to use that analogy. So my role is very much around scheduling and managing the milestones and the roadmaps, if you like, and unblocking, some of those roadmaps, where we have challenges and where we have constraints, etc. And that's, pretty much drawing on the rest of my career, being in project management and consulting, very much around organizing limited resources, planning, budgeting, managing risks and issues and interdependencies, the whole planning and portfolio management, but now really applied to digital transformation at an enterprise level. That's what I spend my my days doing. And then I guess, linked to that, but in my personal capacity, I write books and I develop online courses, which I host on platforms like Udemy, and on my website, peteralkemer.com. And really that's I think an outflowing of my experience and my career into my personal capacity, where I've seen a huge take up and a huge audience, I think, as you've experienced, of people looking for more information, especially as the world digitizes more and more and we become more reliant on new and advanced technologies. People in their own personal capacity and their families and their home lives, and which has been accelerated by COVID and the pandemic and the lockdowns, have been trying to get to grips with digital ways of interacting, digital ways of doing things in their lives. While it provides a lot of convenience, it provides huge catalysts for change, and people are grappling with exactly what the fundamental principles and forces are that are driving that change. And so in my books and my courses, that come at these topics from different angles, I try and unpack that and make it real for people, and practical in their lives as much as possible.
Fantastic. It's such a great idea that you're giving back knowledge like that, because, there is so much need for people to just learn. And like I said before we started recording, that's the reason why we actually have this podcast, just so that we can teach, we can inspire, and people can learn, anything that has to do with technology or digital transformation, just to equip and for people to actually share their experiences. So thank you so much. Now let's get into the depth of things, Peter. Let's talk about digital transformation. Digital transformation is such a buzzword in the tech industry, and just generally in the markets. What is digital transformation? Let's start by defining what digital transformation is.
100%, Sarah. So I think, and what I break down in my book and in my course, is that a lot of the buzzwords come more from digital disruption. So what happens is that these technologies go through hype cycles, and some of them are well adopted, and some of them become very disruptive for businesses who have relied on ways of doing things and processes that have not taken advantage of those new technologies, possibly because they're too big and it takes a while for them to adopt those technologies. So typically the smaller companies that don't have that legacy of operations and manual processes, they can adopt these new technologies very quickly. And they can sometimes get what we call exponential scale, to the degree that they're able to then become a competitor in the same markets and the same industries as these traditional organizations. So in the course and in the book, I teach 6 chapters or 6 lessons on digital disruption. And the buzzwords that you talk about are really in that space of digital disruption. And we've seen it in our own lives. So digital transformation is then the response of large organizations to the disruption that they see in the marketplace. And the digital transformation is the journey that they go through to make sure that they survive. Number one, many large organizations don't survive. And we've seen across travel, accommodation, logistics, many large organizations who have been in the Fortune 500 global firms, reliable stocks that have delivered consistent growth year on year. Within 2 or 3 years, due to these disruptive technologies and these exponential companies, they've literally gone out of business. So all the business school case studies, etc., about how you need to build capital-intensive businesses, you need to own large assets, you need to manage the flow from a producer to consumer, which was really the second and the third industrial revolution. All of that theory has gone out of the window as we've seen this digital disruption. And you get a range of different topics in that space. You get deceptive growth, you get dematerialization, you get demonetization. And if you look at the exponential firms like Airbnb and Uber and Alibaba and all of these household names, we've seen and we've benefited from the services that they provide us. But when you look at those businesses, you can see common things that have happened to them, often things that they themselves weren't intending to achieve, and that just because they used these technologies in new ways and they were able to solve problems for customers who were used to these old companies and these old ways of doing things and thought there was an alternative. And when they saw the alternative, they latched onto them because it solved their problems so well. And because it provided such improved customer service, they shifted their business away from these traditional companies. So that's really the digital disruption. The digital transformation then is largely what happens in the big organizations, who then say, well, we need to put a plan in place. We need to put a strategy down that makes sure we survive and that we get through this, and that we too can take advantage of these same technologies. Because whether you're talking about artificial intelligence, robotics, or cloud, or any of these buzzwords that have come up, they're available for everybody to use. So what we do in large organizations, and what you've probably seen with a lot of your clients, is those large organizations saying, okay, well, we see these technologies, we see what other companies have done with them, we see how our markets have been disrupted and how our customers are moving away from us to businesses that are using these technologies. How can we respond by changing our business model, by changing our processes, by changing our operations, by changing the way we work, in order to embed those technologies in our business and how we go to market? Now, the challenge is that's not easy, because large organizations are well established. They've got traditional and established ways of doing things. They've got a workforce that have been managed largely in a very hierarchical manner and told what to do and how to do it, and are then rewarded on keeping that status quo, and a large middle management layer that organizes and structures the whole business. Digital transformation then comes along and says, well, how do we reorganize ourselves? How do we change the way we work to make use of these technologies and think about our business a lot less from the inside out, and our processes and our operations and how we manage things, and think about it a lot more from the outside in? So how do we become a lot more customer centric in the way we design our products and services, how the way we organize ourselves, and adopt these new technologies that we see in the digital disruption in the marketplace? And that's then the role of any digital transformation team, I think, is to embed that thinking throughout the organization, to drive and run a series of programs and projects that have very clearly defined outcomes and objectives, but which can be very disruptive internally. So you bring that digital disruption inside, but in a way that is properly managed and have clear milestones, and the workforce and the management and the shareholders can see exactly what's going to happen every step of the way. Because you take an industry like banking, it's still very regulated. We have a lot of customer data. There's a lot of compliance and risk management that we have to incorporate in how we work. And that won't change regardless of the technologies that you use. So you can't just hope for the best and let these technologies be adopted without some sort of structure and planning about how it's done internally. So digital transformation in a large organization, it's responding to digital disruption, it's adopting these new technologies, it's changing the way that people work, and it's becoming a lot more customer centric in how you go to market and how you design your products and services. And the fourth industrial revolution, which you mentioned just before we started recording, is really where the consumer and the producer are almost effectively equal actors in an ecosystem. And traditionally, second and third industrial revolution, there was a large organization with a pipeline business model where the products flowed through this pipe to the consumer. And because those consumers, their parents and their grandparents and other businesses in the market used those products, everybody just used the same products, and it was a reliable, trustworthy brand. In the fourth industrial revolution, because the consumers now have a strong voice in those ecosystems, that feedback is coming from the customers. They see the other technologies in their own lives. And businesses that traditionally had a stronger role as a producer are now having to meet the individual consumer requirements. And that's the interactions that you get within ecosystems. So Sarah, that's, I guess the overall digital transformation principles and thinking that, I've developed over the years, and that certainly I've enjoyed learning about myself and talking to other people about.
Very, very insightful, Peter. So then let's talk about a digital transformation strategy. How does a company then embark on that journey? So they realize that, our customers' thinking has shifted and they are demanding for us to transform with this big organization. Where do they start? How do they go about it?
Yeah, so Simon Sinek, his brilliant book, Start With Why. You have to have that why. You have to ask why 5 times or 7 times. And whatever strategy you put in place has to answer that question. And if you just do digital transformation because you want to use the buzzwords, that's not a good strategy. That's not going to be sustainable. Then you just play around with technology, and you can do that anyway. A strategy has to be specific to your business. It has to be specific to your culture, your customers, and the direction that you want to take. But it has to be informed by what's possible with those technologies. So there's, looking at the market, looking what other companies have done with it, but then saying for us and our industry and our market and our customers and our workforce and our direction, and what could be quite radical for that organization. And this is where, consultants and market research does play an important role to redefine what those organizations should look like. And you do see a lot of successful digital transformation strategies. For example, John Deere, who is a very traditional supplier of machinery in farming and agriculture, managed to develop a very successful digital transformation strategy. We've seen lots of examples around the world where those large organizations have taken a very radical approach to reinventing their business. And perhaps they should have been doing that anyway, but now it's a little bit more existential, and their strategy has become one of survival. Because if they don't have that ambitious strategy, their customers are going to switch, as we've said, to other companies that are using those technologies better to serve those customers' needs. So I think that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that the digital transformation strategy has to be very customer-centric. And if you were to walk into the reception of many large organizations over the years, as I've said, Fortune 500 companies, you'd see a very impressive vision and mission and set of principles and things that the organization, has adopted. But it's often very internally focused. It's often very it's an internal mindset. It's very great sounding language from a business school, but a customer will walk in there and say, "This doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't mean it's tell me, how your products are going to help me better solve my life problems better, or help me in my life stages, whatever stage I'm at in my life that I have changing needs, etc." So as I've said now with the fourth industrial revolution, the consumer has a much stronger voice. Information and the awareness of customer feedback on products and services has become increasingly democratized. And that's been the digital disruption of the media business, for example. Facebook is the biggest advertising company in the world, but they don't develop any of their own content. They're a platform and an ecosystem within which people advertise, share content, and compete for what we call the digital attention economy. And so within that digital attention economy, a lot more focus is going on the benefit that I as a consumer or I as an actor in an ecosystem am going to get. So Uber responded brilliantly because they said, well, we'll have a car with you in 5 minutes, pick you up because they know exactly where you are to within 2 meters. Airbnb said you can book a room anywhere in the world, within 5 minutes. So you just go through the list of all these exponential companies, And I think what's important, Sarah, is that many of them didn't actually sit down and spend a lot of money developing a good sounding digital transformation strategy. They were also agile and applied continuous learning to say, there's a good enough strategy, let's execute and apply and learn and then revisit that strategy sort of continuously. It became a living, breathing definition of what they wanted to do, but very much based on what they were able to accomplish. And companies like Instagram nearly went out of business 5 or 6 times before they became such a successful photo sharing app. And one of the case studies I talk about in the book is Kodak, a traditional organization that had digital photographic technology. But because it was so disruptive to their film and chemicals business, they didn't have a digital transformation program. So if Kodak had a digital transformation program back in the 80s, when some engineer sitting in their laboratory figured out digital photography, which they did actually, and they'd gone, they'd said, hey guys, we've got this incredible technology. What do we do with it? The board members and the executives of Kodak would have said, well, this is going to cannibalize our traditional film and chemicals business, but we have a plan to shift our business away from that and into this new technology because we see that's the direction that the industry is going to go. But because they didn't have that just internally disruptive thinking, they wanted to entrench the status quo. So they doubled down on their chemicals and film business, and they actively worked against the technological disruption that they knew about internally, but over time with Instagram started to come at them from the outside. And in the same year that Kodak went bankrupt, Instagram was valued at $1 billion, I think, or $500 million, and then sold to Facebook for $1 billion. And really, what did Instagram do? They digitized and socialized the sharing and the creation of human memories. So if you talk about a strategy, they went right back to first principles. Elon Musk, for example, is great on first principles. He always goes back to first principles. The use cases that companies have developed over the years are often second or third abstractions of first principles. So the first principle of Instagram is, I want to conveniently share and create human memories. Now, Kodak's use case was to do that with film and chemicals. But when a new way of doing that, which came along, they weren't able to adapt their business. They weren't able to digitally transform to adopt that new technology. So that's, I mean, and we can look, at these examples with hindsight and learn from the tragedy of Kodak, for example, as many people have, and as I've researched it and written about it in a very practical way for people to learn from in my book and in my course. But ultimately, it's about saying, what is that change? What is that new direction that we have to go in as a strategy that helps us be a lot more internally disruptive, a lot more adoptive of these new technologies, and a lot more customer-centric in what we do and how we go to market, etc. So yeah, that would be for me just a lot around digital transformation as a strategy.
Beautiful, beautiful. And in your book, you talk about other companies. I was very intrigued when you talked about Nokia, for example, and the coming in of ways. Do you just want to touch on that and just many more other case studies of companies that ignored digital transformation? Because really it is fascinating to think these big businesses have been brought to their knees by very small startups simply because they ignored, digital transformation.
100%. So you're reminding me now what's in my book. I must go back and read through it again at some point. But okay, the Nokia case study is fascinating. And I think the Nokia example just talks about how quickly these waves of creative destruction are coming at us. So Nokia had a very clever strategy. They realized that vehicle telemetry was going to be very important. So the knowledge about where a vehicle is on a map and on a road to optimize for routes and direction and deliveries and logistics, etc. They figured out that was going to be very important. So they knew that getting data about a vehicle's location was something they wanted to achieve. And they decided that was a strategy that they wanted to go for. So they bought a company called Navtech, which had developed sensors along millions of miles of roads in Europe. Physical sensors, right? And as the cars were able to pass these sensors, they could pick up, where those vehicles were. Okay. And I think they bought that company for $8 billion or something, staggering amount of money. Now, in parallel with that, the other company you mentioned, Waze, was a startup in Israel. And they, I think, not through necessarily a clear strategy, but just again through this idea of agile experimentation and continuous learning, because now the phones were becoming mobile phones become a lot more advanced, etc., and starting to have their own GPS in them. But obviously, private information about the location of your phone was something that people were protecting. Waze simply asked they were trying to build an app, a navigation app, and they would have struggled with the same issue that Nokia was trying to solve, which was getting data about the vehicle location and other vehicles' location. So they said to themselves, why don't we just ask our customers? Let's just ask our customers if they can share their GPS information with us. And their customers said, yeah, great, fantastic. So now all of the Waze app users started sending their vehicle locations back to Waze, right? Which Waze was able then to manage and we talk about big data and machine learning, quite a lot as buzzwords in digital transformation. But again, Waze was harnessing massive amounts of data points from all their users' app locations. So wherever the phone was, so now again, and it was a bit of a discontinuity in their thinking. Nokia were focused on the vehicle and the physical sensors that would track that vehicle. Waze were looking at the phone and the location of the phone through the GPS and the willingness of the customer to share their data. But obviously, when the person was in the car, the vehicle and the app the location was synonymous. So that's where Waze became very powerful, because the more data they got, the more they were able to feed their algorithms to develop traffic patterns around where their users were and what the hotspots were and what the best routes would be to take, etc. So that, as I say, that creative destruction of the dematerialization, and this is one of the principles of exponential companies we spoke about just now. Dematerialization is the reduced reliance on physical products, physical devices, physical sensors, physical hardware. And when you had thousands and then tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people sharing their phone locations to one place that could then be sent back out to everybody, this was a dematerialization of those physical road sensors that the NavTech company were trying to develop, and which quickly became completely redundant, because those cars no longer needed to report their physical location through a physical sensor when they had a digital equivalent of that through the GPS location of the device, which was in the car. All right. So Nokia made a massive error in buying that company, NavTech, and they eventually sold it, I think, for, I don't know, a few $100 million or whatever it was, and all of those sensors had to be scrapped. So billions really that were lost in that wave of creative destruction. Now, of course, Google Maps, okay, and you get this arbitrage. So as soon as somebody figures something out and a clever way of using data, then everybody can do that. And you get the creative waves of destruction get quicker and quicker as people try and figure out the next best use case using everything that everybody else has already figured out. And the cycle of innovation gets quicker and quicker because everybody's building on everything else that everybody is doing. So now Waze, once Google was then able to use the same amount of data and build that into their Google Maps, Apple was able to build that into their maps, etc. Waze had a period when it was very good and very innovative and has a fantastic user interface, and a lot of people still use it today. But a lot of that, once again, became democratized in all of the maps features and really is second nature for us. And while we used to drive around with physical map books in our cars, if you remember, you used to go to CNA and buy that map on the shelf, right? You'd keep that,
Absolutely.
and then it'd be over 5 or 6 different pages, and you'd have to page through the things. Now you just put your phone on your headphones, and it talks you directly to where you need to go, right? Again, that's a dematerialization of that physical map. that we no longer need. The dematerialization, we're dematerializing. Another example is Uber, right? I mean, so you have all these hire car companies that rely on fleets, physical fleets of cars, that you would then arrive at an airport and hire a car to drive around while you're on your business trip or your holiday with your family. Now you walk out of the airport, you type in your location, and a car arrives to pick you up to take you to your hotel. So you've dematerialized the physical hire car. Somebody else manages that expense, and they provide a singular service to a person within that ecosystem for the duration and the requirement of that person at that specific time, which is very much like the gig economy, and it's microservices, micro products that are provided to people at discrete points in time and location when they need it, etc. Same with Airbnb. Airbnb is the biggest accommodation provider in the world, but they don't own a single hotel. And they've become more successful than some of the biggest hotel chains around the world, where their traditional business model was to buy real estate, to buy blocks of hotels and accommodation, and then rent that space out. And Airbnb said, well, anybody can rent a room or a accommodation facility, but it only has to be for a specific time and a specific person at a specific location. And on their platform, they were able to provide that intuitive customer experience that matched the providers, the producers of that accommodation with the consumers of that accommodation, rather than the capital-intensive businesses have existing real estate that stands there that they then have to sell and drive utilization of. The newer business model that is this double-sided marketplace of consumers and producers is much more efficient because it matches people based on what they can provide and what is required. So Sarah, I mean, all of that, is a couple of the examples that you sort of asked about and that I touch on in the book, and which do provide fascinating rear view mirror examples of winners and losers. And in a lot of the talks that I've done, I talk about the winners and losers of digital disruption. And maybe the last one to touch on is Apple, and a great example of internal cannibalization as part of digital transformation, where we always used to use the Sony Walkman. You'd have your Sony Walkman with a tape.
I remember that.
Physical tape. You put a tape in there, right? And we all remember, making a mixtape or whatever. I mean, I used to make a mixtape for my friends or whatever, but you needed a physical tape, and you put it in a Sony Walkman, and you put that on your belt, and you walk around. And, we all thought that's iconic. It's never going to be disrupted. And Sony also had digital audio. They had that technology. But then Apple came along with the iPod Shuffle. And because they could digitize audio, you could store a lot more files, a lot more songs. And again, you put it on your belt and you could listen to your songs with an iPod Shuffle. But then they realized that the phone was getting so advanced, you would eventually be able to move your song library onto your phone. And of course, Apple built the fantastic iPhone, and we can talk about that as well just now. But they realized that the iPod Shuffle was going to be disrupted. And if it wasn't them, it was going to be somebody else. So they cannibalized internally that iPod Shuffle business, and they merged the iPod capabilities into the iPhone. And you had iTunes and the music libraries that we all experience today. And they cannibalized their own iPod business. And there are some product lines still available out there today. So you went from the Sony Walkman to the Apple iPod Shuffle to the Apple iPhone. Those were the cycles of creative destruction that happened with regards to, music libraries. And of course, there are a lot of other brands and products that rode those various different waves. But importantly, creative destruction should also happen within organizations where people are intentionally cannibalizing product lines, because if they don't do it to themselves, competitors going to come along and do it to them. And so that's a good example of how we've learned from Kodak to avoid something similar within an organization like Apple.
Absolutely amazing and fascinating. I love the concept of self-disruption from inside the organization. Do you want to touch more about that? Let's just dive into that.
For sure. So Geoffrey Moore, I don't know if you remember the cycle of adoption, right? So you always had the early adopters, you had then the late adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. And we see that in our own lives. Whenever a technology comes out, whether it was Twitter or Uber or Airbnb or WhatsApp, there was some of you in your friend circle, somebody say, hey, I've got this new app, right? And you think, oh, another app, and then all of a sudden it becomes necessary. And then everybody's on that app and you have to get onto that app, right? So you could put yourself on that curve, right? Either you're an early adopter, but now what happens is sometimes you're an early adopter and it doesn't catch on, right? And it falls into the chasm of failure. And there's probably a couple of examples like that where you downloaded an app and it just didn't take off. Or you downloaded an app, used a certain technology, and you're so thrilled because you were one of the first in your community. And when everybody said, hey, I'm now on WhatsApp or I'm now on Uber, and you would say, yeah, I was on it like last year already, type of thing. So the product adoption cycle that was developed by Geoffrey Moore was adapted for the internal organization. And he divided it up into 4 zones. And he said, you got the zone of, I think it was innovation, experimentation, the zone of differentiation, and the zone of mainstream adoption. Now, what you talk about, this idea of internal creative destruction, is exactly what a board, an executive team need to do, right? They need to decide where they allocate resources. And that zone of experimentation, in the banking industry, we ran a very successful code fest for many years, which is like a hackathon, but internally where we allowed our developers and business people to get together in a room for a week and to build whatever they wanted to, experiment with the latest technology. We separated them from the network and they couldn't break anything, but they could just go mad. They could do whatever they wanted to and have fun and be agile and, interview customers. And we had a little bit of a competition. And like we all know about hackathons, it's this rapid innovation under certain conditions that incentivizes people through competition or other means, intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, to develop cool things, right? Now, the question is whether you take some of those technologies and you put them in the main parts of your business, okay? And that's the decisions that managers and executives still have to make. Do they back a certain technology and a certain product line sufficiently enough to put the resources behind it that's going to cost them massively if it's a mistake, if it doesn't take off, if it doesn't meet their customer expectations. So this idea of internal creative destruction is one that Geoffrey Moore then expanded on that product adoption curve to develop internally, and one which I've used when I wrote a couple of papers about our Code Fest. And there's a research paper that's actually been done on it by Gibbs Business School, which is now available in the Harvard Business School research library for business schools to teach around the world. And it talks about exactly this question of, yes, you can play with things on the side, but when do you put them into your business? And Google has a website actually called the Google Graveyard. And, what they do is they are very good at quickly assessing how successful something is, because it might be successful in a hackathon where you've only spent a very small amount of money getting a few people together to play around with some technology. When you put it into a mainstream business, for some reason it doesn't work, and you have to quickly decide, do you double down on it? Do you change the leadership? Do you change the way you're offering it? Or do you just get rid of it? And that's what Google Graveyard is products that have been through that cycle of internal innovation and internal creative destruction and has not survived. And of course, we're all well aware of the fantastic products that have become mainstream and which have survived and done exceptionally well. So, yeah, I mean, that's some thoughts around internal creative destruction, which I think is, as you say, a very important topic, and one that, executives are rightfully very nervous of, because if they don't adopt these things, other people are going to do it to take away their customers. And they're going to wish that they obviously had taken that risk and put it into the mainstream of their business. Another fantastic example is Google Glass, right? We talk about Google Graveyard. So Google thought, that people were going to wear glasses and have this little camera on the side, and through augmented reality. So AR is augmented reality. Virtual reality is an entire headset that fits over you. So that then takes you into a virtual reality. But AR, augmented reality, is you're looking at reality, but it's augmented with additional information. So now no longer would you be listening to your phone to help you navigate. You'd put your Google glasses on, it would see the road, it would know your location, and it would then show you, just like if you've watched in the Terminator movies, it would show you additional information through these glasses as you're driving. I mean, and that was just one of the many use cases of it. The failure of Google Glass was quite simple, is that humans don't want to wear a GoPro.
Absolutely.
That's okay. And Google actually hired one of Europe's top fashion designers, because when they realized it wasn't taking off, they figured, okay, it's the human psychology of not wearing a camera on your face. Just they could not get people convinced that that was a good idea, despite all the benefits that you'd get from it. And they had to shelve it eventually. And it's become very useful in automotive manufacturing and engineering plants, where technicians working on a conveyor belt will wear a Google Glass, and they'll have information come up on that screen about what it is that they're doing, whether they're fixing an engine or wiring a circuit board or building a product, etc. So in the manufacturing and engineering space, the Google Glass has actually found some very viable use cases, etc. So Sarah, those are a couple of examples of household names, companies that we're aware about that have gone through these cycles of creative destruction. And often I think it's very important that it sometimes is not exclusive, right? It doesn't have to be or, it can be and. And often it's an evolution of an existing product line that adopts these new technologies in quite radical ways. It doesn't have to be a binary discontinuity. So in my book, I talk a lot about the creative cycles of destruction that have discontinuities between them. So you cannot innovate a candle to develop a light bulb. There's a discontinuity. It still solves the problem of providing light, but a candle to a light bulb is a discontinuity. So too from a traditional light bulb to an LED light, which is where the lighting technology is going. And the same for the horse-drawn cart. You cannot improve a horse-drawn cart to get to an automotive vehicle. If you were to ask the driver of a horse-drawn cart, what is their requirement? They would say, I want a faster horse. Okay? So when you talk about creative destruction, there's a limit to incremental innovation on an existing product. Just like a horse-drawn cart, you can put more horses on there, it's going to have a limiting factor. You need an innovative disruptor sitting outside of the product line that thinks about it completely differently and says, we need an engine instead of the horse, right? That's a discontinuity. And that's a binary creative destruction, okay? And one of the biggest reasons they didn't get rid of horse-drawn carts in America was because they said, well, what about the jobs of all the people who clean up the streets after all the horses? That was one of the biggest reasons in America that was holding back the adoption of the motor car. And so the horse population of America declined rapidly. And horses eventually moved back out into the farms and into agriculture as the motor vehicle took over. And when you talk about destruction, people obviously get worried about jobs. Now, Uber in South Africa has been a net creator of jobs. So despite all the headlines and drama that we saw around Uber coming in and taking over all the metered taxi drivers, if you ask your Uber driver, a lot of them are going to say, I used to be a metered taxi driver and now I'm an Uber driver. And they earn more, they have better work conditions, they've adopted that technology, they've moved up that cycle of creative destruction. Now, yes, the metered taxi industry, there was, the traditional jobs that were there had to get adapted into the new way of doing things, the new industry. And that's what digital transformation has to do, is to take people with on that journey and ensure as far as possible that they cross over the discontinuity or they understand the adoption and the change, if it's incremental, to their lives and to the products that they support and to the work that they do, to obviously go with on that journey. And throughout history, Sarah, even back to the Luddites, which I talk about in the book as well, the cotton mill workers, when the cotton mill machinery came in and they tried to destroy it and protest against this new technology, net jobs were created through that. And I guess, it's only when we reach what we call, general artificial intelligence, that we feel there might be now, serious job destruction. But up until that point, everyone is generally agreed that humans adapt and develop new work that takes advantage of the technology and the creative destruction that's happened in the past. And we'll always move ahead of the technology and the creative destruction. And the companies that can do that internally and take their workforces with them are the companies that will be successful at digital transformation.
It's so great that you talk about the impact of digital transformation, because the moment people hear digital transformation, people think of loss of jobs. So it's actually very important that as practitioners we can actually bring this narrative that it's not necessarily that technology is coming to wipe out jobs. In fact, in certain circumstances, technology is actually creating jobs. And I love that whole example that you give around Uber. And even Airbnb, more entrepreneurs have actually come into the market that otherwise would never have had an opportunity to run a business in the hospitality industry. So it's actually very important that, we center this conversation around the opportunities that technology brings, so that people are more aware and people are open to take up these opportunities.
I think you're so correct there, Sarah. And, it all comes back down to this evolution of humanity and how well adapted we are and how well suited we are to adapt to our environment and the changing circumstances, whether it's technologies or organizations or new products and services. And, in all the conversations that I have, and whether it's in a large workforce or, as you say, in an entrepreneurial environment, it's that adaptability, it's that understanding and awareness of the principles and the forces that are coming at you and disrupting your world, and the knowledge and the understanding of those that you can then use to change the way you live and work, to adapt them and to adopt those technologies to continue being successful, but in new and different ways. And that's really the thesis and the sort of principle and the practical application that I try and achieve with my book and with my courses and everything that I teach and talk and research about in my private capacity.
Fantastic. Beautiful. Peter, just to close our conversation, which has just been so exciting and fascinating, I would like you to just bring some advice. What advice would you give to business leaders when it comes to digital transformation, especially within the African context?
Yeah, great question there. And I think, we have a current jobs crisis already, right? Which you could trace back to a current educational crisis. So there are some minimum building blocks that we need in both the public, private, and educational sector that have to be in place, on top of which we can adapt to a broadly changing global context, right? So those basics have to be in place. I mean, that basic understanding of how the world is changing, how the business world is shifting. We have to be able to communicate that. We have to be able to understand that. We have to think about how that will arrive on our shores and what impact that'll have on our local context and communities. But my fundamental belief, like you mentioned, is that and I teach a couple of courses, for entrepreneurs who can use these free and user-intuitive technologies to start a podcast, for example, like you've got going, to write a book, to build out a product line. And it's the entrepreneurs in the context of their communities that know best what their environment needs, and that environment and the people around them are going to be their customers. And it's again coming back to what we said about customer centricity. If you can understand what your customers want, and you can build and deliver and run and manage a successful organization that meets those needs, that is what we must premise our future growth on. And Clem Santa, always used to talk about the high road and the low road. And the high road for me is that entrepreneurial empowerment. And whereas, traditionally it might have come through credit and finance or other things that we were in, had scarcity of, now it's around technology. And the scarcity has become the skills and the knowledge to use and harness that technology and apply it to your local context in ways that meet the needs of the people around you, which will then become your customers. So that's the one angle of it. The other angle of it is the global brands and the lift and drop, mentality that might be, let's say, too hard for us to replicate locally. And as you mentioned, is it easier just to sign up to Airbnb or to create your own little accommodation ecosystem? So we have to make sure that these global brands, have a local context to them. Netflix, for example, has great local South African content built into its library. Uber, for example, they actually have a fantastic localization strategy around the world, where in all of the countries they operate, they develop features that are relevant to that city and that country. And the engineers and the analysts and the people that work in Uber's offices around the world can try those features out on the global Uber platform, but only for the people that are in that location. And then based on the data, they can use the data and the take-up to use those features around the world. So you could have somebody working for Uber in Johannesburg that builds a feature that then gets adopted onto the global Uber platform. So, those are two thoughts on localization and local opportunities for people. And through my role in the commercial division of the large bank where I was working, I used to spend a lot of time with SMEs. And, we have some of the brightest minds in the world that are the most competitive that you could ever find. And if you match that thinking and that intellect and those street smarts, with the right technology at the right time, you can have exponential businesses taking off. I mean, we've seen Cape Town becoming a hub for techpreneurs and becoming very successful brands that are then exported, globally, and for people that become incredibly successful. So we need more of those. Sarah, I think that would be my final message. And in and through all of that is this educational theme, this access to technology, localized awareness and understanding of buying patterns and consumer behavior. But as I do say, minimum building blocks, food, water, infrastructure, basic education. There's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we have to solve before you can get to that level of innovation. Unless we're able to innovate for some of those lower level rungs on Maslow's hierarchy, that would also be fantastic. But some of those are a lot harder to innovate on. But I wouldn't discount some of our bright entrepreneurs being able to democratize water production, for example, or to democratize electricity production. And we're already seeing it. Microgrids throughout Africa, home generated, solar generated power being fed back into national grids. That's a classic example of the fourth industrial revolution. It's just, again, how does that fit in with society and regulation and government and the management of society as a whole? But Sarah, fantastic conversation. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. It's been a conversational masterclass, I guess.
Thank you, Peter. I have absolutely enjoyed, this conversation, and I am looking forward to having more of these conversations with you. I am just so grateful to you for making time to just come and pour yourself and the knowledge that you've acquired to our listeners. So till we meet again and we see each other, ciao, ciao. Thank you, Peter. Enjoy your day.
Thanks, and goodbye. Goodbye to your listeners as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.